Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It's just really nice to have, this is just the right amount of people, I think, to do just a bit of a more intimate look at some of the manuscript acquisitions that we've gotten in the music division in the past about 3 years. My name is David Plylar. I'm in the concert office of the music division, but I have a great interest in, particularly in keyboard music, but also in music of the 19th century and 20th centuries. And it just so happens that a lot of our recent acquisitions in the music division have been of very significant pieces, mostly out of the 19th century, but some from the 18th century and beyond. So initially, the idea for this talk was going to be to speak about a whole wide range of them. And what I found is that we have so many amazing, interesting new things that there's really 5 or 6 talks in there, and so we don't have enough time to hit everything, so I decided to whittle it down to just the keyboard music from recent years. Stay tuned for another time when one of our curators might speak about some of our other amazing acquisitions, including songs, orchestral works, and other things. I'm probably going to stay seated a bit more than usual today just because my back is acting up a bit. So please forgive me for that, but what I'd like to do is introduce you to a number of these manuscripts and show just a few things about each one, what they tell us about the piece, what they tell us about maybe the circumstances surrounding its composition, and also just anything else that might be of interest. It's not comprehensive whatsoever. Every time I glance at these manuscripts, I keep finding new and interesting things, so they're really this is really kind of an invitation for scholars to come and take a look, but also for the public to come and take a look at these really interesting pieces of music. So we're going to go in chronological order between the things that we have with us today. So what we'll have on the tasting menu, as it were, we'll have a Haydn Capriccio, an early, probably one of the best known of his early keyboard works from 1765. We'll then have Beethoven's sketches for the Hammerklavier Sonata, 1817, 18, I think. And these are new sketches that we have that supplement our older sketches that we already had in our Whitall collection. So this is also a recent purchase. We'll take a look at those. Then we'll look at 2 Mendelssohn songs without words. And then we'll look at 3 pretty interesting Liszt pieces, 2 of which you may know, one of which you probably don't unless you're a real Liszt nut. But one of them is from the Consolations. One of them is one of the Liebestraume, or an early version of one of the Liebestraume. And then the other one is an elegy. And then lastly, we'll hit, we just recently purchased numbers 2 and 3 of Opus 119 by Brahms. And so we'll focus more on the second one, and you'll see the reason why I'm choosing these particular pieces as we get to them. So let's start with the Haydn. One of the things that's nice about this particular manuscript is it gives us a lot of interesting material on the front page. So first of all, you'll notice that that title is spelled with 1 C for Capriccio, whereas typically it's with 2. But that's just one of those things. And then there's almost indecipherable something written underneath it. And then there's some other indecipherables that seem to be there. They are decipherable, and we'll talk about that. So oftentimes we'll look at, when looking at these manuscripts, we'll be discussing how do we come to get them, how do we know they're authentic, those types of things. In this case, it's kind of almost a case study in one of the ways that we might determine that it's an authentic type of thing. I should say that I'm not an expert in this, so this is just what I'm gleaning from the page. You do see a signature there that says Del Giuseppe Haydn, and then MPPRIA, which means manu propria, so meaning in his own hand, and then 765, meaning 1765. So that's, that's something. And then underneath it says, in somebody else's hand, Handschrift. we then look at the what's written at the bottom of the page, and it's somebody saying, the guy who wrote Handschrift, I know him. He's the Abbe Stadler, and he's the one who wrote this. He was a friend of Haydn's and knew him, and so we can take his word that this was in Haydn's hand because he said it was, and I knew that he's the one who wrote the word Handschrift there. So that's also on this title page of the manuscript. And then if you go to the upper right corner of the top of this title page, you'll see a very interesting thing. This is, it's supposed to be in Tobias Haslinger's hand, and he was a major publisher and composer. And so this was number 39 from his collection of manuscripts that he had. So we knew that he had it at one point, and stamped on the front. Owners tend to write on these things quite a bit, as you might notice. So then we start to look at these, there's kind of this history of different people who have owned it, not necessarily in this order, actually, it's slightly out of order. But an interesting thing about this manuscript is at one point it was actually at the Library of Congress before now, and this was when it was part of Gisela Seldengoth's collection. It then left the library, to our dismay, and it only now is returning and is actually now a part of our Seldengoth collection on its return. So that's just a kind of a quick, brief overview of what you get from this title page. So underneath that title page, or sorry, underneath that title of Capriccio, it's a little bit hard to read, but it says Acht Sauschneider müssen sein. And so basically that means it takes 8 butchers. And so what this is referring to is this is based on an Austrian folk tune. And so Haydn is, one of the things I don't think he does get credit for it, but not enough, is he had a really good sense of humor. And so he basically wrote a capriccio about castrating hogs. And so that's kind of what this is about. Just a couple other things that come through in this manuscript, and you'll have to take a look at this up on stage after this talk. There are places where there is copying over with what is clearly a different ink. It looks like, at first, it might look like it was a second dip in the inkwell or something like that, but it's deviates quite a bit from the sepia tone that you'll see with the particular ink in this manuscript. So it's tracing over is what I think, because there's enough places where there's double stems and things like that. So I'm not sure if this was Haydn doing it. I suspect maybe it was, because it seems pretty close to what was there, but I don't know. But that would be something that maybe somebody would be able to look into that. But that's something that people will look for on manuscripts, are these points of deviation between what's kind of established as a norm and when it changes, because it can also be, in addition to showing potentially another person's hand involved, that type of deviation can also delineate a timeline when somebody's making changes. So you'll see this, especially in publisher proofs and things like that there'll be different colors used, like in crayon or other things, to kind of show either different types of edits or edits that happen in one pass. So it's kind of an interesting thing to start to see, 3 or 4 different colors, either pencil or different colors of ink, on the same manuscript, because you might be able to reconstruct, with some degree of speculation, in what order those types of changes were made. So now we're going to move on to Beethoven. So as I mentioned, we do have several sketches already in our collection related to the Hammerklavier Sonata. In particular, in that case, the finale, the last movement. The new sketches that we have are from the 3rd movement. So this is the slow movement. And so what I thought I'd do is just play through the entire Hammerklavier Sonata twice, so you can get a sense of how that. So just don't worry. I'm not going to even play any of it, actually, because what you can see here is that these sketches are identifiable as related to this piece, but not extremely specific in terms of what they might be referring to. So I'll show just a couple of examples on the screen so that you can see what it is that makes one see that these are related to the Hammerklavier. I don't know how well people know this particular movement of the Hammerklavier, but the piece it's a giant movement, so it's about 20 minutes in length. And it consists of a number of, it's extraordinarily beautiful, I think one of his most beautiful slow movements. Has a lot of different textures in the piano that are, I think, quite forward-looking and also quite distinctive. So what we find in this particular set of sketches are kind of literally sketches or gestures toward those final gestures that are recognizable in the final piece. So that bass pattern that you just saw on this page, whoops, that we just see those little, basically a chord, and it might sound like something like this. I'm assuming that he's just not giving the key there, and so I was playing it as it is in the piece. You then see that same figure is used now underneath some ideas for melodies and also for accompanimental figures. And just to make it clear, I've circled those little bass things that were on that previous page so you can see what was there. So it's trying to give some context, but still very sparse, not very clear. Yet each of these does gesture to different points in the piece. Sometimes it's something like this, which is there are points where the melody is laid out in just bare octaves in the B-A-R-E, not B-E-A-R, in the Beethoven. And so there's gestures towards that. Then you'll see certain things that he does, alternating figures where he doesn't keep the details of what's happening in those gaps, but there's stuff going on in those gaps. And so a lot of times, actually, what I found is that he'll sketch out the accompanimental materials knowing what I suspect is that he just knew what the melodic components were going to be because it was based on this large set of variations. So he probably just doesn't need to mark that down as a marker at this point. That's, again, speculation, but this is kind of what one does with sketchy material. So in any case, that's all I'm going to say about the Beethoven for today. But these are interesting to take a look at. There happen to be a lot of Hammerklavier sketches around, and so you can, all around the world. So they've never really, I don't know that they've all been gathered into one place ever, and even just for people to take a look at in book form, but actually that's probably anyway, they continue to be found and scarfed up by different libraries and institutions. We should mention that we also have several other major Beethoven works, but one of our crown jewels is the Opus 109 Sonata. So that's one where we have the full sonata. So moving on to our Mendelssohn acquisitions. The Library of Congress has, I think, 4 or 5 of the Songs Without Words. 2 of them are in the Grabe album. We have these 2 new ones that I'm going to speak about shortly. And then we also have another recent acquisition that I didn't pull out for today are some edited forms where we, of a printed score that Mendelssohn has annotated with his changes. So those are the kinds of things that are really interesting for researchers to learn more about, to be able to see what a composer is fixing. Are they just fixing mistakes? Are they making substantive changes? Those are the types of things that we like to see. And one of the things that we learn, and I think we'll see this here, is that it's really hard to say with much confidence that there's any one authoritative source for a lot of pieces. So a lot of people think, well, if the manuscript is in their hand, that must be the be-all, end-all of what we know what the composer wanted. Well, these composers were, many of them, involved in the process of putting a piece through publication. And so there would be different things that would happen at those various stages, sometimes that completely change the course of a work. Sometimes they, if they aren't careful, mistakes will creep into it at the printing stage, and they'll be handed down as gospel, but then, but they're, potentially incorrect. We'll have a good example of that with the Brahms. So in any case, with Mendelssohn, the manuscripts that we have are beautiful. I was just speaking with my colleague Ray about this earlier. His handwriting is just a pleasure to look at, as you can tell by the signature that we have on. This is from one of the songs without words that we have over here, the Opus 62, number 5, Consolation. And so they look perfect. Oops. Oh, I'm going backwards this way. They look like perfect on the page. Like there's not really anything out of place. But what I discovered with Opus 62, number 5, in particular, is that there's some missing material. So if you'll take a look at that, there's a big red arrow in the midst of that first page of the manuscript there, and I've just kind of put in brackets on the right side of the screen is a whole chunk of material that Mendelssohn later added to the piece. And it ends up balancing it out a bit better. But there's another interesting difference, and this happens at the very beginning of the piece. And it's a little bit hard to see. I don't think I have a close-up of it now. It's a little bit difficult to see, but basically the beginning is truncated from what it is in the final version. So I'm gonna play just a very little bit of this so you can hear what I'm talking about and what those differences might be. So here's first how it would start as Mendelssohn wrote it in this manuscript. Not exactly that part, but the point was that it goes into it very quickly, so it's just. So there's almost no time before that A comes in up above. In the final published version, this is how it is. It's a subtle thing, but it's the kind of thing that composers would do as they keep thinking about a piece and find ways to better establish. So what basically he did was he added 4 attack points, for a total of 5 notes. It works out because one of them is a dyad, but just to give a little bit more of that rocking motion, these are the famous Venetian gondola songs that he incorporated into these songs without words. So he thought better of what he had originally to kind of create a greater sense of this. So then as it keeps going, I'll show you what he goes from, and then I'll show you what he changed it to. And this is just a little bit into the piece. If you're looking, it's on that second stave on the left. and so on. But what he left out was the second iteration of the main theme. So the first time that you hear it, it's like this, just basically. So it's a repetition, it's a further establishment of the theme, but it's not in the manuscript. So in this case, I don't know the full history of this piece from this point to its publication, but presumably, and this was in 1842, I think, it would have been something that was, of course, authorized by Mendelssohn, and the changes are probably for the better in this case. I hesitate to make those types of value judgments only because there are a lot of cases where the types of changes are just alternatives as opposed to really necessarily inherently superior. So especially when we get to the list, but we'll see about that. So that's this a little bit about this piece. I won't play this one. It's a bit more of a straightforward one. It's from C major, but about the same time actually, 1842. I can't remember whether this one is a few months before or after the other one that we just looked at. But this is another example of Mendelssohn perfect, except that, as you notice towards the bottom of the page, I'm willing to bet that Mendelssohn thought, I wish I had, 18 stave paper, right at that point when he hit that bottom. But those are the kinds of things I like to think about that composers, there's a practical element of, when they're making these fine copies that, it's just kind of one of those things. But you don't want to rewrite it because it's a laborious task to have to write everything down. Okay, so we're going to move on to some of our recent Liszt acquisitions. These ones are fascinating because in Liszt's case, they tend to be multiple versions of the same piece across a span of years. That's generally what happens. In these cases, there are a couple of different things happening. So I'm going to start with a piece called Madrigal. Has anybody ever heard of a Liszt Madrigal? Probably not, but you probably have heard of the Consolations, the famous third one in D flat, everybody knows. This is not that famous one, but it's the fifth one, which is the set as a whole is played quite a bit. A lot of people know them. This is the first version of that fifth Consolation. And so this is coming from, it's actually also the earliest known part of that set. I think this one dates from 1844. And the Consolations themselves I won't get into the full history of them, but essentially get published by 1850. But in 1848 and 49, they go through two different versions. One version that was not published at the time, that Liszt retracted basically, and then and replaced with the final version that everybody knows. But so this one was being prepped for publication, and in this case, this is an example of a non-holograph manuscript. And by that I just mean not in the hand of Liszt, although there are some annotations that are in Liszt's hand. It's thought that the author, not the author, but the copyist involved with this one is August Conradi, who was an associate of Liszt's and who had is thought to have been the person who drafted this. So when you see it on the table, you'll notice that it's a very different style of writing and one that is meant to be very clear, because it's meant to be conveying exactly what's there to the publisher that's coming. So what I wanted to show you, there's some interesting things that happen with this. This piece was actually recently published. A version of this manuscript was published in the Neue Lisztausgabe, and which is a long-running publication of all of Liszt's piano works, and hopefully eventually they'll get to all the other stuff too. But the edition was based on our manuscript that we have back when it was in private hands and before it came to the library. But what's interesting about it is that there's some mistakes in the published form. And so this is another good reason why it's always good to have access to that original source whenever you can. And it's always better for them, in my opinion, I'm a bit biased, for them to be in a public institution where researchers have that access as opposed to in the hands of a private collector. Because it's difficult to go back and always make assessments for purposes of scholarship. But for what we're looking at now, I just want to show you a little bit about this evolution from a starting version of the madrigal up to the final version. I'm not going to be playing the full pieces, but I'm just going to show you some different things about each piece and about how Liszt adapted the work to kind of end up with a very different piece in the end than what he started with. So we will start with a comparison of just the main theme to the, sorry, I'm pulling it up. I've got too many papers. Oops, yeah, all right. So here's the version of the madrigal. I'm just gonna play the opening theme. There is an introduction that I will talk about in a minute, so I'm not gonna play the introduction. This is just the opening main theme. Okay, so that's that opening theme. And here's the same theme, but in the final version. It's a simpler setting. This is something that Liszt did all the time. His revisions tended to simplify. This is the most famously done with the transcendental etudes, which were originally called the great etude, this great set of etudes that were impossible to play, and then they became the easier transcendental etudes, and vice versa. The transcendental Paganini etudes became the great Paganini etudes, which were easier to play. But he also does it here for a textural reason. So the main difference is that in the earlier version, we have this bass line that keeps holding over, whereas here in the new version, it's just kept up in the middle register. Now this is not new to this version actually. Liszt is simply transplanting what he does later in the original version to the beginning. And so it's just a kind of a reconfiguring of the piece so that it starts off with this greater sense of simplicity. As a couple of other examples of simplifying, here are two passages just to compare. So you see again a simplification of the accompaniment to just again, there's nothing wrong with the other one. It's just a different configuration. There's also something that's very different, that's much more dramatic, which is this. That's a line that Liszt just gets rid of in the later version. I like it, so that's why I think it's nice that the original version exists, so I can hear it. That's one of the other things that comes up. As far as the actual Liszt annotations on this manuscript, I've circled it on this screen so you can see one of the main ones, which is the crossing out of a couple of notes. Now, it might not seem like this is a big deal, and maybe in the grand scheme of things, it's not a big deal, but this particular transitional idea, he has no fewer than like three or four different types of ways of dealing with it. So in the original version, you would have heard I'll give you the several different versions, and then they're in sequence. So the original one would be the triplets, then without them, then a secondary one, another one, and then the final one. So 4 versions. It moves quite easily to that where it is, but Liszt didn't like that for some reason. That's if you take a literal interpretation of that crossing out. What the editors in the new Liszt edition did was they smoothed it out so that it matched more the first version of the Consolations that were published later. And that's what this is what that sounds like. And then in its final version, it's like this. So it's no longer on the downbeat. So it's very subtle differences, but these are the kinds of things that are of interest, not just to musicologists, but also to pianists, because one of the big things that's, it's actually, I should just confess that it's really hard to play different versions of pieces that you know, because you keep wanting to revert to like how it's supposed to go, like every way that you've always heard it or whatever. And so it's kind of, you have to try to get into the zone of just trying to approach it as it is, as opposed to what it will be. And one of the things that I notice about this piece in particular, going from the Madrigal to this new version, is that it there's this, it just becomes easier to play and just more pleasurable to play as well. And sometimes it's something as simple as just a reconfiguration of what's happening in that left hand that makes that happen. And maybe it's not such a big sonic event that everybody's going to know, but the pianists can definitely feel it. Then I want to show, I'm quickly running out of time, so I want to show a couple of interesting things about how he takes what is a motto at the beginning in this introduction and eventually turns it into a motive. So if you'll bear with me, what I'll do is I'll just show you a couple of instances of this motto introduction. I can just play it right here. So here's the way that every version of this piece begins. So that's how it is in every one. There's certain things about that that then seem to, this, that becomes turned into a motto right there. I'm sorry, into a motive right there that gets developed, it's part of the theme. But in the original version, he kind of builds up to this big moment where the motto comes back as it is, except now in double octaves, and it's a very big sound, and I'll try to play it. It's really kind of a beast, but here's how it moves into this. goes on from there, so it kind of gets this, suddenly you're in this like giant, like big sound land, and that's not what he does in the final version. Instead, he goes into a place where he moves into a kind of a coda type of material that focuses on that that kind of material. And I'll just play a little bit of that so you can see what the difference is. So it kind of creates this very much more easygoing type of approach to it. One last thing I'm going to say about this piece, just in the interest of time, is that it has a spectacular different ending. It's just a very different ending from the original. I'm sorry, from the version that everybody knows. And so I'm just going to play that for you, but this is the part that's misprinted. It has to be a mistake, I think, in the new Liszt edition. There's just I won't play the mistakes, but hopefully I won't play the mistakes. But this is how it ends. So it's a beautiful ending. There's nothing wrong with it, in my opinion. So it's just a choice that he made to alter it and change it. And the other ending works perfectly with the new setting, perhaps. So he just felt it fit more. But there's certainly, in my opinion, not anything wrong with that ending. It's a beautiful one. So I'm glad that we have the manuscript is it's still there. Quickly skipping ahead here. We have several different versions of a pretty famous piece, and this is the second notturno, or the second Liebestraume. Often they're called a Liebestraum, but technically they're supposed to be Liebestraume number 1, Liebestraume number 2, and Liebestraume number 3. Love dreams about each one. So the second one the third one's the most famous one that you've probably heard. The second one is also pretty well known. It's thought that perhaps the second one's origins, these pieces are kind of like the 3 Petrarch sonnets that are famous from the Italy volume of the Année de Pèlerinage, in that they were originally songs. And so were the Liebestraume, except that the second one, the one that we're going to be talking about, may actually have originated as a piano piece. And so that here's just a sense of the 2 main themes that we're going to be looking at briefly here. Here's theme 1, followed by theme 2. Theme 2. That's the earliest known version of this piece. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but you can get a sense of it. It's very simple. That's the idea. the library recently got something that was another version of this piece dating from the it's definitely pre-Notturno 2 version of this that's basically a dedication copy that was copied out for presumably an admirer named T. Katz. We can't figure out, I'm not sure who this person was, I'm dying to know. But this is something that composers would do from time to time. They would write out kind of either a quote from a famous work or something like that, or some type of album leaf as a way of giving a gift to somebody. So that's essentially what this is. And I'll just play it for you so you can get a sense of it, because there's certain things that we learned from this manuscript that the library has on display right over here that then affect some other things. So that's all there is to that one. It's still a very short thing, but there are two things that come into play right away that one notices in the second Notturno when you get to the famous version of this piece. One is that there's this opening introduction. When you get to the Notturno, here's what it sounds like, roughly. The crosshands material that you saw makes its appearance in this final version as well. So instead of where the left hand awkwardly went over, in my way of playing it, it becomes something a bit more lush in this main version. So forth and so on. What becomes interesting in particular the library's holdings is that we actually possess a later version of this piece from 1865 that was given to Olga von Meyendorff, one of Liszt's friends, and she held on to them and wouldn't allow them to be published, is actually a set of 5 pieces, 4 of which were published in the 20s and the 5th one published much later. And so this is the first of that set, and it represents a kind of a rarefication process of what we had heard, so that it becomes this, even though it's a simplified version, in some ways I think it becomes kind of the arrival point for this piece. So I'm just going to play the introduction to that so you can hear it, and then a couple little pieces of it. It's a short piece, but I'll still just play bits of it. This amazing arrival point that we get to is this. And so even though it's kind of less of like a giant sound than the original version, to me it's just as effective because it's in the context of a simple piece. And I think that by this stage with this particular piece, that was Liszt's thinking had evolved to that point. Not that evolve is a bad word, but you get the idea. So we have that other manuscript, so you can compare this early version with that late version, and that's the last version that Liszt wrote of this piece that we know of. He had a tendency to write a lot, so who knows, there might be other versions of this. In fact, there are other versions of it out there, but okay. So I'm skipping ahead a little bit. I want to hit a really important piece, which is the Schlummerlied im Grabe. This is what would eventually become the first elegy. It was written to commemorate, well, it was as a memorial on the death of Marie Mukhanov, who was a friend of Liszt and also a very fine pianist by all accounts. What's interesting about this, I found that this piece had been published recently, but it was published with a different manuscript. So the publishers of the new Liszt edition did not know about this manuscript when they were doing this. So we have, it's a very, there's some things that are quite different about it. But one of the funny things about it is that, again, not that an elegy memorial type of thing is a funny situation, but he wrote this in the course of a few days, and he wrote versions for cello and piano, cello, harp, harmonium, and piano. Eventually became a version for violin and piano duet. For some reason, this piece Liszt was really taken with it, and he wrote several of those versions within the space of about 4 days in July of 1874. He writes a note to Olga von Meyendorff, who we just mentioned was the recipient of that last piece that we heard. It's saying basically at this beginning part, make sure that you differentiate the triplets so 3 against 2, make sure that you're playing it correctly. And he actually quotes it in the letter so that you see this. Apparently, maybe she had a tendency to play it this way. But here's just an example of what he's talking about. And so it's kind of actually a bit on the awkward side as it gets going. The thing that I want to point out about it, I think there's no avoiding. I'm going to go just a little bit longer than expected, so I apologize for that. You're welcome to take off if you need to. But I want to show you the difference between the initial setting of the introduction one climactic moment, and then a couple of things from the ending of this piece. And then just so you can hear what it sounds like, because this is a piece that I don't think many people know, but they should know because it's just a great piece, I think. So at the beginning, here's what he has in our version, which I believe is the earliest version. Then it goes on from there. In the version that's the same title, this is what they have in of the Schlummerlied and Grabe that's been published. So there's an extension here that's going on, and then when we get to the final version of it, I believe that the cello is what led Liszt to do this, because it fits perfectly in the cello range, and he said that he was writing it contemporaneously. Here's what it ended up with. Low C is at the bottom of the cello range. And so this is one of the rare cases where chamber music of Liszt's own writing probably, in my opinion, influenced his piano writing. It's a rare thing because Liszt didn't write much chamber music, so it's one of those things that you can kind of learn from this. This piece grows to these kind of this giant climax, and I'll play two of those versions right next to each other so you can see the different ways that Liszt approached it. Here's the version that we have in manuscript right over here. The other thing that changed very interestingly is the end, and I won't have time to play you all the different versions of it, but in the version that we have, I'll play that one since that's what we have over here. The Schlummerlied that was published has an Ossia passage that's, I'll try to remember it here. So that's how he ends it there. And then just kind of to finish this off, I'm just going to play you the final version of the piece just so we have something to end. If anybody wants to stick around, I'll play a little bit of the Brahms to show that, just so that we can hit that as well. But I think it's important just to at least hit this piece too. So here's the final version of the elegy. So you can see how, like, all these elements, and I didn't have time to show you some of the other types of things related to this motive that get interpolated more, I think, effectively in this final version that we hear. But there's a lot of interesting things for people to take a look at with the manuscript that we have, especially as it relates to also the Liszt's other elegies. There's several other ones that I think have a fairly clear relationship to this one. This was the first of them, but there's a song, Die Zelle in Nonen Wert, that also is very much related to this, that he calls his another type of elegy. I know we're over time, so please, if you need to go, that's fine. I'm just going to tell you a couple things about the Brahms since I have it out here, so that you can see it. One of the things that I always like to notice with Brahms is when he deviates from what the published score is in a manuscript. We have several good examples of that in the music division, but in general, Brahms did not like his earlier versions of things to get out. He didn't want people to know what he was thinking at first, so he was that kind of a perfectionist. So there's something right off the bat that we see with these late piano pieces. He would tend to write these piano pieces and kind of keep them stored away and eventually put them together in groups. So they weren't necessarily always conceived as sets, but in this case, with Opus 119 numbers 2 and 3, they were written back to back in the manuscript, as you'll see over on the table. So in this case, you can also see that he's scratched out a word and changed the name of the first word to andantino. Maybe that's not such a big deal, but there is another big difference in this piece, and it's one that is significant. The way that Brahms laid it out, I'm going to look specifically at the Opus 118 number 2. I'm sorry, 119 number 2. It's set up as basically an ABA form, so it has a beautiful kind of allegretto middle section, but it has a very distinctive front section. I'll play you a little piece of it so you can hear what it sounds like, that develops in a very kind of interesting way rhythmically. In the manuscript, though, what we find is that he's actually got it set up so it's a literal ABA. He's got some different endings that are signified, but there's not supposed to be this development across the beginning of the A section and the return of the A section. You can see that there's this, it means it to repeat back, and then when it gets to the sign that has the arrow pointing to it on the screen, it will, you then go to the short, brief little coda that's at the end. Well, the thing I noticed when looking through this, there's several different things. And before I get to that, I'll just mention that the Stichvorlage, the version that's basically an engraved version that's just about to be published, is missing a measure that Brahms, you can see there on the bottom right, Brahms. So it's present in the manuscript, but it's missing at that stage. So composers have to be ever vigilant to make sure that nobody overlooks it. And this is another case where I thought that I bet Brahms was thinking, come on, how would you think that there's going to be a 7-bar phrase here? Even if you don't read the music, but I don't know that he thought that, but I can kind of assume he did. But the big difference is here. And I'm going to try to just play this for you a little bit so you can hear what it is. But it's actually different music and a different, slightly different harmonic pace too of what's happening from the published version. So I'm just going to talk without the microphone just for a minute to give you a quick overview of what this major change is. So here's the basic idea of the opening section. So it's kind of got this melody on top of these kind of I think they're kind of funky, 16th notes, repeated notes, thing that go on. As we get a little bit down the road with it, I've printed out the 3 different versions of this. He moves into a triplet section in the final version. This is what that sounds like. can see that it slows down a little bit. It's because he's prepping this part. And so forth. But what he does in this version, what's right there, is not the triplets. So this is what you have. And again, this is a little bit hard to play because I have the other thing in my head. So I'll just play it so you can hear next to it. Here's the triplets. So that's the kind of idea. And this is what he has there. This is the part that's really different. So that does not exist in the final version of the piece. What he does is that when it comes back, when the A section returns at the end, he does a variation on this that speeds up and it feels like it's just a ratcheting up of tension. So here's what that version sounds like, and I'll try to follow it on my page. So there's this, I'm not going to play the whole piece for you, but if you hear it in the context of the full piece, there's this very calculated sense of rhythmic activity that's very much affects the dramaturgy of the piece as a whole. So it's an interesting change that he made. Had he not made it, I don't know that people would have thought, oh man, this was a good piece. This would have been a good piece if only he had made this a triplet section instead of something else. But the fact that he did, I think, created a certain through-composed component to it that it affected the arch of the piece in such a way as to, in my opinion, probably improve it, and certainly in Brahms' opinion, because he wouldn't have changed it otherwise. So this is the kind of, this is just my last example of the kind of thing that you'll find when studying the manuscripts here. We have so many manuscript materials, and not just these holograph sources, but first editions, things that you'll want to compare between pieces that it really benefits study. It's remarkable how much work has been done on them, and it's also remarkable how little work has been done on certain things. So if you have a pet project, you want to come in and just compare a favorite piece or something like that, and we have any primary sources with it, it's really something that I think that you would enjoy looking through our collection and looking through other versions that we have, because you never know what you might stumble across. People do it all the time in our collections. They'll find either things that are missing or just things that were overlooked. There's just so much volume of material and so few people who are literally going through it that we encourage everybody who's interested to come check it out. So thank you all very much for staying a little bit longer and also being such a good audience and listening to me talk about these recent manuscript acquisitions. And so please come up and take a look, and I'll be happy to show them to you. Thank you.